It was a late October afternoon in the small town of Cedar Ridge, a place most people would describe as the very definition of sleepy. If you asked anyone, they would say it was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's business, where the streets were quiet and the houses stood like old friends, each one keeping secrets from the others. The local high school, Cedar Ridge High, was no exception. Nestled on the edge of town, it was an aging brick building with ivy creeping up the walls. A school that had been around long enough for its floors to creak and its windows to show the marks of time. Inside, everything felt normal, at least at first glance. Students filed through the hallways between classes, laughing and gossiping, backpacks slung over their shoulders. Teachers stood in their classrooms, eyes scanning over their lesson plans, some humming softly to themselves. The day was no different than any other, or so it seemed, but there was a weight in the air, something just beneath the surface, a feeling that never quite left, something that caused the hairs on the back of your neck to prickle when you walked into a room, even though no one was there to make you feel that way. The faintest sound in the distance would make you stop and listen. A cough echoing in the hall, the flickering of lights, the way the shadows seemed to move at the edges of your vision. It was hard to say what exactly it was, but every student felt it. It started the day they arrived in their freshman year and stayed with them, creeping along the walls under their feet. Some of them would talk about it, though most would laugh it off. "It's just an old building," they would say. "There's bound to be a few weird things here and there." But deep down, they knew there was something wrong, something that lived within the school itself. That afternoon, a sense of tension had begun to settle into the school, heavier than usual. The skies outside had darkened early, the clouds rolling in thick and fast. There was a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the temperature. The weather forecast had called for a light drizzle, but it felt like something worse was brewing. The students couldn't put their finger on it, but a shared unease hung over the building like a shroud. A small group of students, including Jason and Emily, were gathered at the lunch table in the cafeteria, talking about the upcoming Halloween dance. Jason, with his messy hair and unassuming grin, was the first to mention the strange things that had been happening in the school. "You guys ever hear about the old part of the school?" Jason asked, his voice dropping slightly. "The one that no one goes to," Emily replied, raising an eyebrow. She had heard the rumors before, whispers of a forgotten hallway, a room hidden deep within the school that no one dared enter. The teachers would never talk about it, and the students who had gone in said they'd never do it again. Jason nodded. "I think I heard something about it being used during the war. Some sort of shelter or storage or something. No one's really sure. But they say the place is cursed or haunted. I've heard strange noises coming from there at night." Emily's face twisted in skepticism, but she couldn't shake the thought that there was some truth to it. She'd spent enough late nights at the school to know that there were parts of the building that didn't feel right. And every time she walked past the old gymnasium, she couldn't help but notice the cold air that seemed to seep out from beneath the heavy doors. "Well, whatever it is, it's probably just some weird noise or old pipes," Emily said, trying to sound dismissive, but her voice wavered slightly. She'd always been the skeptical one, but lately, even she couldn't ignore the odd occurrences. The flickering lights, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, even in the middle of a crowded hallway. Jason smirked. "Maybe, but I think it's more than that. You know what they say about this place, about how it was built on land that used to belong to the original settlers. People around here claim they can still hear things at night. Footsteps, doors slamming, that kind of thing. It's like the building's alive." As Jason spoke, Emily couldn't help but glance at the clock on the wall, the minute hand ticking away, its echo somehow louder than usual. A sharp bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, and the students began to shuffle toward the exits. But Emily lingered for a moment, her gaze shifting to the corner of the room where the shadows seemed to stretch and move. Something about that corner unsettled her more than it should have. Anyway, Jason said with a shrug, standing up from the table, "I'm heading out to track down the source of those strange noises." "I don't know. Coming? I'm not sure I want to go digging around in some old forgotten part of the school." Jason laughed. "Come on, Emily. Where's your sense of adventure?" She hesitated again, but finally, her curiosity got the better of her. "All right, I'm in, but only if you promise we don't get caught." The two of them walked toward the exit, making their way through the crowded halls, their footsteps muffled by the din of chatter. Yet, despite the noise, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, following them. It was a familiar sensation, one she had always felt in this place, but had never been able to explain. As they walked past the old gymnasium again, Emily glanced over at the heavy wooden doors, the air inside dark and cold. For a split second, she thought she saw a shadow shift behind the door, as if someone or something had been standing there. Her heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" she whispered to Jason, but he had already moved on, his mind focused on their mission. "See what?" he asked, glancing back. Emily shook her head, chalking it up to her overactive imagination. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. There was something more to this school, something buried in the walls, and she wasn't sure they were ready to uncover it. But there was no turning back now. The building creaked again as they walked deeper into the halls, the old floorboards groaning under their feet. The lights flickered once more, and a strange, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, like the school itself was breathing, waiting. Jason and Emily made their way deeper into the school, their steps echoing unnervingly through the abandoned halls. It felt like they were walking in a different world now, one where time moved strangely and shadows seemed to hold secrets that never quite revealed themselves. The feeling of being watched hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. The school's usual hum, voices, laughter, the shuffle of feet was absent now. The halls felt empty, but not in the comforting way a quiet classroom might. No, this was a silence that pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. Emily's heart raced faster with every step, but she couldn't bring herself to turn back. Jason's curiosity had always been boundless, but now it felt like an infection, spreading, compelling her to follow. "So, which way?" she asked, her voice a little too loud in the stillness. Jason stopped in front of a door at the end of a long corridor, looking up at the faded numbers. "This is it," he said, "room 206, the old storage room. I read about it in an old yearbook. Apparently, it used to be part of the war shelter, but they sealed it up after, well, you know, the stuff that happened." Emily glanced at the door uneasily. The building had always had this heavy, oppressive energy, but this particular room felt different. The air seemed to shimmer with an unnatural chill, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. Emily's skin prickled, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she approached. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, more to herself than to Jason. "I mean, we don't even know if there's anything back here. This could just be an old storage closet or something." Jason didn't answer right away. He was too busy fiddling with the rusted doorknob, which squealed when he twisted it, making Emily jump. "Maybe, but that's the thing," Jason said, a grin tugging at his lips despite the tension. "If it's just a storage closet, why do the teachers avoid it like it's some kind of death trap? Why are there so many rumors about it?" Before Emily could respond, Jason shoved the door open. The hinges groaned in protest, and for a split second, Emily thought she saw something flicker in the room beyond. A shadow maybe, but when she blinked, it was gone. Her pulse quickened. Jason stepped into the room, his voice echoing off the walls as he called back to her. "Come on, I don't think anyone's been in here for years. You don't want to miss this." Reluctantly, Emily followed. As she crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped sharply, and her breath misted in front of her. The room was small and cramped, filled with dust-covered crates and old furniture, some of which looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But that wasn't what made her skin crawl. No, it was the feeling, like the room itself was watching her, like it was alive in some twisted way. Jason was already poking through the crates, tossing aside old papers and forgotten items. Emily hesitated near the back of the room, her eyes drawn to a large old mirror hanging on the wall. Its surface was cracked, the glass yellowed with age, but something about it drew her in. She stepped closer, her reflection blurry and distorted. Maybe, came from behind her, followed by a whisper that seemed to float in from nowhere. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes scanned the room. There was nothing but Jason, rifling through the boxes. Jason looked up, his eyes wide with curiosity. "What? I didn't hear anything." Emily shook her head, pushing her hair back nervously. It was like a whisper. It was soft, but it felt like it was right behind me. Jason dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "Probably just the wind. It's an old building. Things creak and groan. You know how it is." Emily didn't feel convinced, but she didn't want to seem paranoid. So she forced herself to look away from the mirror and focus on something else. But that whisper lingered in her mind, repeating in her ears like a tune she couldn't shake. As the minutes ticked by, the air grew heavier. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when it happened, but something shifted. The faint, unsettling hum they'd heard earlier, the one that made Emily feel like the whole building was holding its breath, grew louder. And then, as they rummaged through the crates, Emily thought she saw movement in the corner of the room. A shadow. She spun around. "Jason!" But before she could finish, the lights flickered, plunging the room into complete darkness for a split second. When they returned, the shadow was gone. Jason didn't notice. He was too busy holding up a rusted object, something that looked like an old compass. Emily's pulse thudded in her ears. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of what she had seen. "Jason, we should go." Jason looked at her, eyebrows furrowed. "What's the matter? You scared?" "I'm not scared. But this place..." Her voice trailed off, unsure how to explain the cold grip of dread tightening around her chest. "Something's wrong here, Jason. I can feel it." Jason scoffed, though there was a tightness in his voice that wasn't there before. "Come on, you're being paranoid." But Emily didn't care. She turned toward the door, ready to leave, but as she stepped back, something caught her eye, something glinting on the floor, a shard of glass. She bent down, and in the dim light, she realized that it wasn't just a random piece of broken glass. It was part of a broken picture frame, its edges jagged and sharp. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. A photograph, faded and yellowed with age. The image depicted a group of people standing in front of the school. In the center was a woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes hollow and dark, as though she had seen something terrible. She wore a coat that looked out of place, almost too modern for the time. But what struck Emily the most was the way the woman was staring directly at her, through the photo, through the glass, into Emily's soul. Emily's heart slammed against her ribcage. She wanted to put the photo down, but she couldn't. Something held her gaze, something that made her feel like the woman was trying to warn her. She could hear the soft whisper again, the one that had spoken her name, Emily. Her grip on the photo tightened, and she stumbled back toward the door. "We need to leave, now." Jason's face twisted in confusion. "What the hell is wrong with you? It's just a picture, nothing to be scared of." But even as he said it, Emily saw the way his eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if he was suddenly aware that something wasn't right either. The temperature in the room had dropped even further, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. A loud bang came from somewhere deeper in the building, shaking the walls, and the lights flickered again, casting strange, twisted shadows. Emily froze, her heart racing. Jason glanced around, his bravado evaporating. What was that? Before she could answer, there was another sound. This time, closer, a whisper, sharp and harsh, as if someone was breathing just behind them. It was then that Emily noticed it. The mirror. It was different now. The crack in the glass had expanded, spidering out in every direction. And in the reflection, there was someone standing behind them. Someone they hadn't seen enter the room. Someone they couldn't see in the physical space. The figure was tall and hunched, its face obscured in shadow. But Emily could feel its eyes on her, cold and piercing. She screamed, "Run!" Jason shouted, and they bolted for the door. But as they reached it, it slammed shut with a deafening thud. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, slammed shut with such force that it rattled the entire frame. The sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence of the room. Jason and Emily froze, eyes wide, hearts pounding in their chests. Their breaths came in short, panicked gasps, their minds scrambling to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded around them. But there was no time for understanding, no time for reason. The room was suffocating now, closing in around them. Behind them, the mirror cracked further, the jagged lines spreading like a spider's web. The shadows in the reflection grew deeper, darker, until they were no longer just shadows. A figure emerged from the glass, its form stretching and warping, as if it was being pulled from the very fabric of the room itself. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were long and unnaturally thin, its body impossibly contorted. The face, though obscured by the shadows, was gaunt, hollowed out, with eyes that glowed a sickly green. They were the eyes of something dead, something not quite human. Emily's chest tightened, and she felt the blood drain from her face. Her feet were rooted to the floor, her body too numb to move. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out, but her limbs refused to obey. All she could do was stare, transfixed by the grotesque figure that had emerged from the mirror. "Jason, Jason, we need to go. Now," she whispered, her voice barely audible, tremulous with fear. But Jason wasn't moving either. His eyes were wide, his face pale, his mouth slightly open, as though he couldn't quite comprehend what he was seeing. He was frozen in place, as if the apparition had some kind of hold on him. The figure in the mirror stretched out a hand, its fingers long and gnarled, reaching toward them with slow, deliberate movements. The air seemed to grow heavier, denser, as if the very atmosphere was being sucked into the dark reflection. Emily felt a chill in her bones, as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees in an instant. It was suffocating, and yet it was still. Then a voice broke the silence, a whisper so soft, so low, that it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come." The words slid into their minds, crawling into their ears and nestling deep within their thoughts. The voice was cold, detached, and yet laced with a sickening sadness that made Emily's stomach churn. "You shouldn't have found this place." The room seemed to tilt, the walls warping and shifting, as if reality itself was bending under the weight of whatever this thing was. Emily blinked, trying to clear her mind, but the world around her didn't seem real anymore. The mirror was growing, expanding, as though it was devouring the space around it. The reflection of the figure shifted, now clearly showing the entire room. But in the reflection, Emily and Jason were not standing where they had been just moments ago. They were sitting, bound by invisible strings, their bodies trembling with fear. The figure reached through the glass now, its fingers brushing against the edge of the frame. It let out a low, guttural sound, half a growl, half a moan, as its hand crossed the threshold between the mirror and the room. The air seemed to grow thicker with every movement, like something dark and ancient was waking up, stretching its limbs and claiming its territory. Jason stepped backward, his legs shaking, his mind scrambling for any kind of escape. "What is this? What the hell is this?" Emily opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat. The reflection of the figure seemed to flicker, and then, with terrifying suddenness, it lunged. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, sending shards flying through the air like jagged daggers. For a split second, Emily thought she saw the thing, its twisted, distorted form, fully stepping out of the mirror and into the room, its limbs bending in unnatural ways as it emerged. It felt like time had slowed. She could hear her heartbeat hammering in her chest, her breath shallow and frantic. But it wasn't just a thing of shadow anymore. It was solid, tangible, and it was coming for them. Jason screamed. He turned to the door, slamming his shoulder against it, but it didn't budge. Panic surged through his body, hot and sharp. He slammed into it again and again, but it was like trying to push against a brick wall. The room seemed to close in on them. The shadows stretching, thickening. The figure, it lunged forward, its mouth opening wide. It was a grotesque mix of human and something far darker. Its teeth sharp, jagged and yellowed, like the remnants of something that had been dead for centuries. The air hummed with an awful, crushing force, and the walls seemed to pulse. Emily's mind shuddered. She wasn't thinking. She was just reacting. The figure was real. It was in front of them, inches away now. Emily didn't even know if she was breathing anymore. She grabbed the closest thing she could find, an old metal crate, throwing it in the thing's direction with all the strength she could muster. But the crate passed through the air like it was weightless, colliding with the figure's outstretched hand with a hollow sound before falling to the floor with a sickening clang. It didn't stop it. It laughed, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through her bones. The air grew thick again, and Emily could feel her stomach churn with a visceral dread. She tried to move, tried to find an escape, but it felt like her body had betrayed her. Her legs were weak. Her mind was clouded. She couldn't think straight. Then the figure's hand was upon her, icy cold, its fingers wrapping around her wrist with unnatural strength. She gasped, feeling her skin freeze where it touched, her body going numb from the coldness that spread like poison through her veins. Her vision blurred as her thoughts began to dissolve into a swirling haze of terror. The figure's face was inches from hers now, its twisted, contorted features pulling into a mocking smile. She could feel its breath on her skin, dry and hollow, like the wind in a graveyard. "You shouldn't have come," the voice whispered again, louder this time, echoing inside her mind. And just when she thought she couldn't take any more, the room seemed to lurch again, backward, forward, sideways, as if the world itself was being twisted. Jason was screaming now too, his voice frantic, his body fighting against the grip of the thing. Emily's vision faded to black as a horrible, deafening noise filled her ears. A screeching, tearing sound like the fabric of the universe itself was being ripped apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went silent. The room was empty. The mirror was intact, though the cracks still ran deep. And there was no sign of the thing, no twisted figure, no strange coldness, no unearthly presence. But Emily's heart still raced and her mind reeled. Was it a dream? Had it been real? Behind her, Jason stumbled, gasping for breath, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror. "I don't know what happened," he whispered, his voice shaking. I don't understand." But Emily did. She understood far too well. It wasn't over. The thing, whatever it was, had followed them, and it was still out there, waiting. Jason's hands trembled as he leaned against the cold metal door, his eyes darting around the empty hallway, half expecting something to lunge at him from the shadows. He could still feel the chill in his bones, the weight of that suffocating silence that had pressed in on him. It was a feeling that hadn't left, not since they'd escaped the room. The hallway felt endless now, as though the walls stretched farther than they ever had before. He couldn't shake the sense that the school itself had become a different place, a place that was no longer his. Emily stood a few paces behind him, her hand pressed to her forehead. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if the ground held some answer she was too afraid to understand. They hadn't spoken a word since they'd managed to get out of that room. Not a single word. The silence between them was thick, oppressive. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. What the hell just happened? Emily didn't answer at first. Instead, she rubbed her temples, trying to block out the images that kept flashing through her mind. The figure in the mirror, its cold, mocking eyes, the way it had known them, the way it had whispered their names like it was an old friend. I don't know, she said, her voice distant, hollow. I don't know if I want to know. The air around them felt wrong now, still unnatural. The once familiar hallways of the school had become a labyrinth of shadows, a maze of suffocating memories. They'd left the room, but they hadn't left the thing behind. No, it was with them now, lingering in the back of their minds, just out of sight. Something had changed inside them, something that couldn't be undone. They both knew that. Jason shifted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He glanced at Emily, then looked away quickly, like he couldn't bear the sight of her face. He didn't want to see the fear in her eyes, the way her body seemed to tremble ever so slightly. Do you think even when she tried to steady herself? Jason asked, his voice shaky. Emily closed her eyes, drawing in a slow breath. It's not gone. Not really. She didn't know how she knew that, but she did. It wasn't something that could be explained, not with words. The horror they'd faced wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Something had burrowed deep into their minds, and she felt its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. Jason exhaled sharply. It's not real, Emily. It's not. She heard the desperation in his voice, the need to rationalize it, to pretend that what they'd experienced was some sort of collective hallucination. But Emily knew better. What had happened in that room was real, and it was something that neither of them would ever be able to forget. The mirror, Emily murmured, her voice barely audible. It wasn't just a reflection. It was alive. That thing was inside of it. It wanted us. Jason turned toward her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fear. I don't understand. You think we were chosen? No, Emily replied quietly, shaking her head. I think it found us. Jason swallowed hard, his mouth dry. The words didn't make sense, but somehow they did. The feeling that had gnawed at him ever since they'd seen the figure, ever since it had stepped out of the mirror, was the same. He could still hear the voice, that sickening whisper. You shouldn't have come. You're right, he said finally, his voice strained. It's not gone. The silence between them grew again, thicker than before, and the weight of their shared fear seemed to press down on their shoulders. Emily felt it more than ever now, the strange and unsettling feeling that the school itself had become something else, a place where nothing was familiar, where the very air seemed to be thick with something sinister. Do you think we can just leave? Jason asked, his voice tight. I mean, we've seen it. We've been through it. Can't we just go home? Emily opened her mouth to answer, but the words stuck in her throat. Could they just go home? Could they really pretend that what had happened hadn't torn apart everything they'd once known? She wanted to say yes, to tell him that everything would go back to normal, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. We can try, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but I don't think it's going to let us. Jason's expression twisted, a mixture of confusion and frustration. What do you mean by that? I mean, Emily said, her voice hollow. I mean, it's not over. It's still watching us. Whatever that thing was, it's still here. We're not free. Jason stared at her, his mouth dry, unable to comprehend the gravity of her words. He shook his head, as if trying to shake the lingering thoughts from his mind. Number, I can't believe that. I just want to go home. Emily reached for the door handle, but something stopped her. Something she couldn't explain. A strange pulse in the air that made her feel like she was being held in place by invisible hands. She looked at Jason again, but this time, she didn't see the boy she had once known. She saw someone who had been broken by something far beyond their understanding. Someone who had been marked, touched by something dark and unexplainable. It wasn't just the school that had changed. It was them. They were different now, fractured, and there was no going back. We need to tell someone, she said, more to herself than to Jason. We can't keep this to ourselves. Someone needs to know what happened. Jason's eyes flickered with uncertainty, his jaw tightening. Who? Who would believe us, Emily? She didn't have an answer. How could she? Who would believe in something like this? A thing that lived in the mirrors. A force so powerful it could shatter reality itself. No one would understand. They would write it off as a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown. But she knew the truth, and so did Jason. The truth was that there was something dark in the world, something that could never be fully understood, something that followed them now, lurking in the corners of their minds, in the cracks between their thoughts. The air in the school grew heavier, and Emily's grip on the door handle tightened. She had no idea how they would escape this. She had no idea what came next, but she could feel it. The presence that had haunted them in the mirror was still there, still watching. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. And no matter where they went, and though the school carried on as usual, Jason and Emily could never shake the feeling that something was wrong. The normal rhythms of life, classes, homework, the chatter of students between periods, felt distant, almost foreign to them now. They moved through their days in a daze, like sleepwalkers trapped in a world they no longer understood. Every door they passed seemed to mock them, every reflection a reminder of what they had seen, and that heavy, suffocating presence lingered in the back of their minds, a shadow they could never escape. Jason had stopped speaking about it entirely, refusing to acknowledge what had happened, as if bearing the memory could somehow keep the thing from coming back. He'd thrown himself into his studies, his extracurriculars, as though the more he could fill his time with the mundane, the less likely he was to think about the thing that had crawled out of the mirror. But Emily knew better. She saw the way his hands would tremble when he walked past reflective surfaces, the way his eyes would flicker nervously toward dark corners. Jason couldn't outrun it, and neither could she. They hadn't spoken much about the event since they'd left the room. There were no answers, no closure, just a hollow, gnawing feeling that there was no escape from the darkness they had uncovered. But some nights, when the silence of her bedroom became too much to bear, Emily would replay the events in her mind, trying to piece together what had happened, searching for a hint of logic, a shred of reason. It always ended the same way, with the image of that thing, its eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, staring back at her from the mirror. What was it? What had it been? She didn't know, and that terrified her more than anything else. One afternoon, after school, Jason called her into the library. She hadn't expected the invitation. He'd been distant, withdrawn for days, and the last thing she had expected was for him to reach out. But there he was, sitting at a table in the back, his head down, his eyes focused on something in his hands. "Emily," he said, barely looking up as she approached. "I need to show you something." She hesitated, a shiver creeping down her spine, but sat across from him anyway. His hands were shaking as he slid a small, worn journal across the table toward her. "What's this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It's mine." "Well, it was," Jason said, his voice thick with something she couldn't quite place. "Guilt, maybe, or fear. I've been keeping track of everything since that night." Emily opened the journal, her heart sinking. The pages were filled with scribbled notes, half-formed thoughts, sketches, and fragments of memories. Chaotic, fevered writings that made little sense at first glance. She flipped through the pages, her stomach turning with every word she read. There were mentions of mirrors, of dark figures, of whispers that came in the dead of night. But more than that, there were sketches of something else, drawings of the thing they had seen, its elongated limbs, its hollow face. And then, near the back of the journal, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A note written in bold, frantic letters. "It's following me. It's in the mirrors again. I can feel it. I can hear it. It's getting closer." Jason had been documenting it all. His descent into paranoia. His fears that the thing had never truly left. That it had been waiting for him to slip, to lose his mind enough to let it back in. "Jason," Emily whispered, the words dying in her throat. You don't think it's real, do you? You don't think it's still... Jason's eyes flickered up at her, haunted and wild. I don't know, Emily. I don't know, but I can feel it. It's in the reflection. It's there. It never left. And I can't ignore it anymore. Emily's heart raced. This wasn't just guilt. This wasn't just some lingering trauma. Jason was losing himself, consumed by the same thing that had nearly destroyed them both. He was unraveling, piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I have to go, Jason said suddenly, standing up abruptly, as though he could outrun it by moving faster. He shoved the journal into his bag and turned to leave, but Emily grabbed his arm. Wait, she said, her voice breaking. Please, Jason, we can face this together. We can figure out what it is, how to stop it. We can't just pretend it didn't happen. But Jason shook his head, his eyes wide, desperate. You don't understand, Emily. I tried to ignore it, but it's inside me now. It's in my head, and I can't get it out. Without another word, he pulled away from her and hurried out of the library. Emily stood there for a moment. She had seen the weight of his words. She had felt the same things, but she had refused to acknowledge them, to give in to the fear that had consumed him. Could she be like him? Was she already too far gone? That night, Emily sat by her window, staring into the darkness outside. The quiet seemed to press in on her, suffocating, as though something was lurking just beyond the edge of the shadows, waiting to reach out and pull her into the depths of its cold, silent world. She couldn't stop thinking about Jason, about the way he had looked at her when he spoke of it, like he knew something she didn't, like he had seen the truth of what they had encountered, the truth of what they had unleashed. Was it really possible that it had never left? Was it still out there, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike again? The next morning, she found Jason's journal on the table. He'd left it behind in his haste, and for a moment, she thought about ignoring it, about walking away from the madness once and for all. But she couldn't. Something inside her compelled her to open it, to read the last few pages. The last entry was different from the others. It was a simple sentence, scribbled hastily, almost illegibly. It's in the mirrors. It's inside me now. I can't get away. It's too late. The page was soaked with ink, and there were no more words after that. No explanation, no final thought. The terror in Jason's eyes had been real. He had known deep down that the thing hadn't just been in the mirror. It had been in them all along. The line between what was real and what wasn't had blurred for him long ago. And now, it was happening to Emily too. But there was still one question that lingered, one thought that gnawed at the back of her mind. Was it really gone? Or had it just been waiting for the right moment to show itself again? Emily stared into the reflection of the window, her own face staring back at her. And for the first time in weeks, she swore she saw a flicker, just a flicker, of movement in the glass behind her. It was waiting, and there was no escaping it now.